What do you do when the world feels profoundly unfair? That's what we're going to talk about today in James 5. You've worked hard, you've been cheated in life, you've waited a long time for something to happen and it hasn't come. And when you are suffering and the people responsible seem to be doing just fine, these aren't abstract questions. These are questions that you ask yourself at 3 a.m. when you can't sleep, or, when you're having a difficult conversation, or you had a long drive home and you're just wondering why there's a situation you can't seem to fix. James 5 is closing chapter of this letter, and James ends where life often ends up, with us wondering about injustice, waiting, suffering, and the questions of faithful people who have circumstances beyond their control. This chapter doesn't give us a tidy resolution. It calls for endurance, rooted in something very real, and we're going to go through all of that. I understand my examples were a bit trite because people are going through real suffering, and so I didn't want to put that down in that. But essentially, it says, and calling out, it even says, "Come on, you rich people, weep and wail your miseries that are coming to you. Your wealth has rotted you, and your clothes are moth-eaten." That's how this chapter starts off. Boy, that is language drawn straight from the Old Testament prophet. It's the kind of scorching indictment that you often hear in Amos and Isaiah and Jeremiah, because it's not politely cautioning us in our lives. It's a prophetic woe. Woe to you, the so-and-sos, right? It's directed at wealthy landowners who have used their power to exploit their workers beneath them. In the first century, the agrarian economy of this area, and the places not just in Israel, but in the diaspora, meaning the surrounding areas, James addressing that. It's not a hypothetical scenario. Day laborers who were hired to harvest the crop depended on being paid at the end of each day. We can see that it's mentioned throughout the Old Testament. You don't withhold a worker's wages overnight. It's a covenant obligation, not merely an economic arrangement. So these men were doing exactly that. James said that they withheld their wages, and it's not silent. They cry out. This image of the blood of Abel crying out from the ground. Injustice has a voice before God. And when the victims can't speak for themselves, God, who hears, is identified right here. The Lord of armies. This is a commanding God of the heavenly hosts. That's the angels at the very end where, the smackdown gets put down. This is not a God who is impressed with wealth or impressed by the silence of people in power. He hears the cry of people who are being exploited, not paid. And this indictment builds. Now, I want to make sure that, we've seen many wealthy people throughout the New Testament and Old Testament. Abraham was a wealthy person. Mary, Martha, and Lazarus were probably wealthy as well. This isn't an indictment on wealth. It is about wealthy people who are lived a luxury for themselves, self-indulgence for themselves, the sense of wasting riotously, spending your life on appetites. I think about the Epicureans who wanted the best in life. They have fattened their hearts, it says, in a day of slaughter. The picture of a cattle that does not know they're being led to the butcher. The content here is a well-fed, completely unaware person who doesn't know what's coming next. The very wealth they've accumulated as evidence of their security will testify against them. And it's, like I said, worth noting that, first of all, we're not talking about all wealthy people. We're not talking as if he's writing wealthy oppressors as if they're in his own congregation. He's pronouncing a prophetic judgment against them, that his primary audience is the suffering believer who are victims of these exploitation. He wants them to know that God sees, God hears, God will act, that these injustices that they are experiencing don't escape his notice. So it's not the wealth itself. It is what people are doing with the wealth and the exploitation that they are doing to people. Brothers, he says, and sisters. I think too, I don't want to get too much into this, but if you get paid a wage and you say, well, I should get paid more, it may not be that you're being exploited. It just may mean that your position is not one of high payment in life. You demanding a salary and you not being paid that salary is not necessarily you being put into suffering by a wealthy landowner, so to speak. I just want to bring it to that because some people, I think, expand this out that if I don't get what I want, if I don't get to live the kind of life I want to give, that's exploitation, and that's not the case. So then he goes on and says that brothers and sisters, be patient, until the Lord is coming. So we have seen that again. He talks about the farmer who waits to receive precious fruits from the earth. He's patient with it, so essentially he waits. I'm the world's worst gardener. I plant a seed and I'm like, is it there yet? Is it there? I just planted a bunch of trees in my backyard and I keep looking at them every day. Are they growing yet? Are they growing yet? Are they growing yet? Today, my pagoda dogwood got flowers on it. See, I'm excited about that. But you got to be patient because the earth is going to rain and you have to wait for that. You don't stop working. You don't just stand there waiting for your crops to grow. Essentially, you have to look at this as a process. So when he talks about all of this, we know that we have a God who sees and a God who will act. The passage of this whole idea of the suffering believer has a foundation in patience. It's not that you're supposed to just be resigned. Well, I guess I'm just going to have a miserable life. Or that you grit your teeth and just have endurance in it. The Greek word that James uses carries a sense of long-temperedness, the capacity to hold the long view when circumstances press you towards a short one. It's the quality of someone who doesn't lose heart because they can't see past the present moment. The farmer illustration is that perfect idea to an agrarian audience. The farmer who once planted in late autumn depends on 2 rounds of rain, the early rains in October, November, to soften the ground, start the germination, and then the later rains in spring in March and April. That's how it works when you're in the land of Israel, to bring the grains to fullness. So between those rain systems, the farmer has to wait. You don't dig up the seeds to check on it. I have done that before. Do not do that because you'll wreck your seeds. He doesn't curse the sky. He works. He tends his farm. He trusts the pattern of God's seasons because he knows how his farm works. The harvest is going to come. And it comes not on his time, but it comes on the time it comes. James wants people to have that future view of it. He adds a pastoral word that may seem a bit out of place. Do not complain to one another. Essentially, grumble, groan. The people who under this prolonged stress and suffering are frequent to turn on each other. Oh, yeah, well, my problems are worse than yours, and people start fighting with each other when they get put under this kind of pressure. We're not talking about an agricultural pressure. We are talking about people who are being exploited, not being paid, and now they're grumbling. Why aren't you taking care of me? Well, that person maybe has nothing either. James is aware of this dynamic that's going on, that the judge is near. And not only is the judge a judge of the wealthy and the oppressed, he's also watching how the suffering community treats each other in the waiting. So it's a judgment on everybody. James brings these 2 examples from Israel stories here. The prophet that endured the long seasons of rejection, suffering, and futility. I think that's the idea, is that when you have these prophets, it just felt futile. The people weren't listening to them. And remaining faithful to the word of God that God gave them. They are counted as blessed because of it. And there's someone like Job. The name Job is an ancient world that is synonymous with suffering and patient endurance. he had extreme suffering, and James does not romanticize it. Job was not quiet, untroubled sufferer. He cried out, he argued with God, he wrestled with it, and he endured. The outcome that the Lord brought about, the resolution, the restoration, revealed something about the character of God. He is compassionate and merciful. And the words that were used here is deeply tendered, full of pity, moved from the inside by the suffering of those he loves. The God of the waiting believer is one of a tender God who is worth waiting for. Then it goes on and gives more pieces of it. There's an elaborate oath swearing that it implies in there, that when your ordinary speech is not reliable enough to stand on its own, and you'll see that in a lot of ways, where we're not, as Christians, supposed to swear oaths, and we'll talk about that here just in a minute. The follower of Jesus should be a person whose words simply yes means yes with authority. Not just because they've invoked a higher spirit to bind them to it. They're invoking God to bind them to it. Because people who are not reliable are the kinds of people who are not bound to their word. You want to be the kind of person that when I say, yes, I will do it, that means you'll do it. And I have tried very hard to become that person. I would say in my 20s, I didn't mean not to do things, but I just was all over the place. I was very scattered. I didn't have very good systems in place. And I understood the importance of being a person when I say yes, that means I do it. And I've been trying that. I mean, I think that's been a very big goal of mine in my life. I think it's how I got into a lot of the productivity stuff. How can I better adhere to my word? But that's what a Christian life is supposed to be about. Their word is their bond. Not because you invoke God's name in it and sort of ramped it up. Oh, yeah? Well, I swear, and you're making a dramatic show of it. Just be yes. It doesn't mean that we don't swear oaths. There are many times in the Old Testament where people swore oaths. Think about like a military people, they swear an oath to this country. We have someone who becomes a new citizen, they swear an oath to this country. It's not about that. It is about that being a person of integrity, that you don't have to add anything onto it. You are formed by the truth and you will do what you say. In a community that's wrestling with sharp tongues, slander of each other, the temptation to manage impressions seems to be more important right now than telling the truth. And so he's giving them the reminder, no, just be people where your yes is yes. And then even goes on further to tell people that the drawing of the community back together to the most important practices, prayer, praise, mutual care of each other. The structure of this is almost like a catechism. If-then statements designed to wire a response. If you are suffering, pray. If you're cheerful, sing. If you are sick, call for the elders. Practice what James describes for the sick, calling the elders. They would anoint with oil and pray in the name of the Lord. People felt like oil was medicinal. Some people thought, too, that maybe it was also accompanied by a massage, so that the oil would be worked in and it would be relieving to the body. I don't know. But essentially, the idea is that they would have understood this, that the anointing with oil had medicinal and symbolic significance in the ancient world. Olive oil was used widely in healing, and it is used in this setting to carry additional weight of invoking God's name over a sick person, a sign that the healing should be brought to this person. And it was not just managing a physical ailment, but bringing faith directed, from the Lord to help this person. The elders were not performing a ritual. It was a community representative bringing that person's suffering into the presence of God through prayer. The promise of James makes that the prayer of faith will save the sick person and the Lord will raise him up. Now, this is a very, you have to be carefully analyzed phrase, and it's been debated over the years. Does that mean that every believing prayer for healing will restore a person physically? No. The broader testimony of the New Testament does not support that reading. Paul prayed 3 times for the thorn to be removed from his flesh, and it was not delivered. Timothy had persistent stomach ailments. Epaphroditus nearly died. What James is basically saying is the power of prayer is that God genuinely responds to prayer of his people. That is, healing is within his power, that the community of faith should not face illness in isolation or silence, and the outcome of it still remains in God's hand. It's important to understand that. The inclusion of sin and forgiveness here is significant too. If he's committed a sin, he'll be forgiven, suggesting that James sees physical suffering and spiritual conditions as connected. It's not a simple sense of illness is a punishment of sin. That's not it at all, but a recognition that the whole person, the body, the soul, the conscience, comes before God in prayer. I mean, I think anytime we look at this world and we don't see Eden, the Garden of Eden sitting before us, it is because sin intervened in it one way or another. So confess your sins to one another. Be communally accountable to each other, mutual prayer for each other. And it's not that the sacrament of confession is directed, to a priest for absolution like they had it in the temple structure. It is about an honest, humble practice of a community to take sin seriously enough to pray together about it. Elijah is James's example of powerful prayer, and his choice for basically humanizing this entire piece. Elijah is one of those towering figures in the Old Testament. He called down fire from heaven. He raised the dead. He outran a chariot. And James said that he was a human being with the same nature as all of us. He's got the same passions, the same weaknesses as any other person. But Elijah prayed to stop the rain for 3.5 years. He prayed again and the rain came back again. The power of Elijah was not Elijah's. It was the God Elijah prayed to. It's the same God who hears our prayer of ordinary people in the church then and today. And the point is not to make prayer feel heroic. It's about making it feel available to every single one of us as believers and for prayer to be available to communities at large. The last image he leaves us in this chapter is basically someone who has wandered away from the truth and someone has gone after them. The word here is meant to be wandered, led astray. It's the same root that we get the word planet. Planets in the ancient world were wandering bodies out there that moved unpredictably against the fixed sky. It's the same kind of idea. The person who wanders from truth is not necessarily someone who made a dramatic public departure from faith. They maybe just drifted. We got a lot of that in Hebrews, right? That most people who left the church were quietly drifting away, silently going away from the church. And that's what he's saying here too, that under pressure of suffering or temptation or slow erosion of community, they stopped paying attention to the church entirely. And James says, go after them. The one who turns a sinner from error of their way accomplishes something profound. They save a life from death. That covers a multitude of sins. And so this language is kind of interesting. It echoes things that have been said in Proverbs 10:12, Ezekiel 33, which talks about the life-saving nature of honest, courageous intervention with someone who's sinning. We're not judging this judgment up as a concern. It's love that takes the wandering person seriously enough to go follow after them. Think of the lost sheep that Jesus goes and gets. Do that, and you will bring back people. It's fitting to end the letter, I was shaped in the first verse with concerns about practical shape of faith. James begins by talking about trials that produce endurance, moves us through favoritism, dead faith, the tongue, worldliness, arrogance, injustice, and ends here with a community that watches out for one another. that doesn't let people just disappear into the distance, lets them go astray. This is what living in faith looks like in a community. It'll never be perfect. It'll always have conflicts in it, but pay attention and be willing to act and go save the lost sheep. Boy, what I'm going to meditate about is, I always say boy, and because it's always like, wow, that was an eyeful of reading right there. Is now we've walked through the 5 chapters of James, what strikes me is, and it's coming to an end, of how practical this letter is and how it really never lets us off the hook. James never lets us feel like we're in a free fall in the world out there. He keeps bringing us back to reality. This is how you treat the poor. This is how you communicate. This is what you do with your tongue. This is what you do when you think you can live life on your own. This is how you should look at God's plans for you. This is how you should go after a person who's wandering away. The letter is demanding. It is demanding. It runs underneath all of the confidence of God, who gives wisdom generously to those who ask. That was said right at the very beginning. It gives grace to the humble. It is compassionate and merciful to those who endure, and it hears prayers of ordinary people. James is not calling on his readers to a performance faith. He is calling them to a life rooted in a real God who loves his people, who's not off into the distance, but sees injustice, responds to prayers, meets the humble with grace, and doesn't let his people face trials alone. That is a God worth enduring for. Like I said, I'm going to think hard. I think this one was personally the hardest book for me in a few ways. And boy, I'm going to pray a lot about this book. And what I'm going to pray about is that we've heard a lot about James, that we know that hearing the word is not enough. I'm not talking about salvation. The promises of God and his salvation are set, all his own work. But what we do after that, where we ask for grace, I ask God that gives us the patience in our waiting. Give us the integrity in our speech. Give us the faith that actually prays. Give us the courage to go after the ones who are wandering away. And give us the heart that acts when we know what the right thing is to do. All the places where we are at and suffering in the world feel so deeply unfair. And it reminds us that God is the Lord of armies, that he hears every cry that reaches his ear. He hears every cry, and every cry reaches his ears, and that he's compassionate and merciful to those who endure. And what I'm going to share with others is the idea that if you know someone who's just been suffering and needs some compassion in life, this is something for the community to do, to pray for people, but we should remind that person that God hears our cries, that he is the Lord of armies, and that his compassion, his gut-wrenching compassion and mercy is for us. He is an active God who comes running after us. All right, everyone, thanks so much. Appreciate you being out there. I hope that this book of James has been incredible for you, as it has been for me. We're going to pick this up with Peter next time. And if you have anything to say to me, you can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. Thanks so much.